So today we begin the third of about six chapters that we're going to be studying in the second unit of our course this semester. Chapter 13 is where we start today. This is the chapter that's called Mass Media Effects, and it begins on, page 342 in your textbook. Now, this chapter, as we work our way through these sets of important points in the PowerPoint presentation, please be thinking about how Chapter 13 information relates to the two chapters that we have just finished studying, the chapter about advertising, Chapter 11, and Chapter 10 on public relations, because Chapter 13 calls into question the idea of whether the attention that we pay to all of the various forms of mass media actually have any effect on us. And I think I've mentioned this once before, but think about this. The entire purpose of advertising is for that message to have some effect on us, for it to capture our attention, to inform us about a product or a service, and then to encourage us, to motivate us to go out and buy that product or purchase that service. And if that message doesn't have that effect on us, then all the money that's been paid to create that message, to produce, for example, if it's an expensive TV commercial, for the time to broadcast it over a TV station, all of that money has been wasted if that message doesn't have an effect on us. So where does that leave us in our discussion about mass media effects? Well, it's on page 342 in your textbook, this picture of the young gentleman at the right-hand side of the screen. My guess is you probably don't recognize this person. This photograph was made, probably around the late 1930s, perhaps early 1940s. And the gentleman pictured here is a very creative person whose name was Orson Welles. He passed away sometime, I think, maybe in the 1980s. His heyday, his real period of stardom, if you will, in the mass media was in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Now, the reason that Orson Welles is pictured on the very first page of this chapter is because there's probably no better person to talk about in the history of mass media when it comes to this discussion about media content having effects on us than Orson Welles would be. And again, you may not be familiar with Mr. Welles. You may not be familiar with his works. I'll be sharing that information in just a moment. But the reason that the author chose to put his picture here is because of a radio broadcast that Orson Welles and a number of other actors acting in a radio drama. Okay, we're not too familiar with that idea of acting in radio dramas. We think more so of watching TV or watching movie when it comes to drama, but certainly in those days prior to the development of television, drama presentations, the presentation of plays, dramatic scripts was very widely enjoyed by the American public and was a really important and crucial part of mass media in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Now, the radio broadcast that we're talking about occurred on Halloween in the year 1938. And there were a group of actors in New York City who every Sunday night performed a 1-hour radio drama that was broadcast to millions of listeners across the country. And notice that I said listeners, not viewers. This was not a television play. It wasn't a movie. It was a radio broadcast. And of course, the people who were listening did so and had to form the images of what was being depicted in the script. They had to form those images up in their head. That's why radio was called the theater of the mind. The acting was so intense, and the writing of the script was using all of the proper words And when you put everything together, yeah, it created some pretty stark and dramatic images in people's heads. They didn't have to look at a screen. There was no screen to look at. But boy, the power of the spoken word certainly helped people form images. Okay, so Halloween, 1938. The program that was broadcast was called War of the Worlds. It was a novel written, I think, maybe around 40 years prior to 1938, late 1800s, early 1900s. The War of the Worlds was the story of the invasion of the eastern coast of the United States by Martians. And so the dramatic play was presented as if it were, now this is entirely fictional, but was presented as if it were an actual live news broadcast of radio reporters and journalists covering the invasion of the eastern part of the United States, principally in the New Jersey area, by the landing of Martians. And there were a number of actors involved and quite a few very realistic sound effects that were incorporated into the presentation. Well, the bottom line was at this time, now again, keep in mind, this is 1938. This is many years ago. No TV, movies still coming into their own. But the fact is that listening to radio broadcast carried a great amount of believability with the listeners. When people turned on the radio, they believed what they heard. What many of them didn't hear was the announcement at the beginning of the program on that Sunday night at 8 o'clock that this broadcast that was coming up was entirely fictional. It was a play, and there was, no truth to it. Well, people who tuned into the program a few minutes late didn't hear that, and they believed, many people, I think probably it's accurate to say that maybe millions of listeners bought into the idea that the United States had been invaded and was under attack by Martians. That's just how realistic this fictional broadcast sounded to people. Well, okay, so what? Well, the what about this is it demonstrates in a very large way the power of mass media to have effects on people. As we've said, this is the late 1930s. The mass media consisted mostly of radio broadcasting, movies, and then the three principal forms of print communication, the newspapers, the magazines, and books. And it was certainly a simpler time. There was nothing digital, no smartphones, no internet, no web. People had maybe a different view about the mass media and the various roles and purposes that mass media content served in their lives. But the bottom line in this instance was this hoax, this, as Orson Welles called it at the end of the program, this little Halloween prank that they pulled on listeners actually backfired in many ways. And as I said a while ago, there were millions of people who were duped, I guess is a good way of expressing it, were duped into believing that the United States had been attacked by Martians. Powerful effect of the mass media, isn't it? Well, so we'll use this as our introduction into chapter 13, and we'll begin our discussion with history of these various models that academicians, people who study mass media and its effects on people, have come up with over the years. Up at the top, please note this is pages 343 through 345. The first theory that we can talk about, actually, it's the same idea, but it goes by two different names, completely interchangeable, and we'll just go ahead and put both of them out here for discussion. I think it was originally known first by the name of the magic bullet theory, and then some people a few years later chose to analogize what was happening in the media as the hypodermic needle theory. So let me explain. If you can picture some mass media content. So it could be the story in a book. It could be an article in a newspaper. It could be an entire movie or an entire radio broadcast. Just in all of these four instances, this is mass media content. Picture that in your mind as being like the bullet in a gun. And the people who are responsible for creating this mass media content at the radio stations and networks, at the motion picture studios, in the newspaper newsrooms, they had their finger on the trigger. And they could point that gun at someone's head, pull the trigger, and bam, just like a bullet leaving the barrel of the gun, that bullet full of media content would enter the brain of a person and go immediately into action. The idea was that, like a magic bullet, the content of the mass media, when it was broadcast on radio, when it was shown on a movie screen, when somebody read it on a newspaper page, that content went immediately to the brain, and it had, just like a bullet, immediate, powerful, and dramatic effects on the person. Now, can we buy into that idea today? Think about this for just a moment. If that were true, let's think about a TV commercial, a 30-second commercial that we watch on our favorite program. And if the magic bullet theory, or the hypodermic needle theory as it's also known, if that were to be true, then what that theory would suggest is the moment we are exposed to that TV commercial, the moment that we watch it and complete, that the message in that commercial would have such an immediate and powerful effect on us that we'd leap right off the couch, run into the car, and run down to the store and buy whatever product was advertised. And we know that's certainly not the case. By the way, hypodermic needle, similar kind of idea. Think of a hypodermic syringe, and the medicine inside that syringe is the media content, the media message. And if the nurse injects that needle of that syringe into your arm and pumps that media message into your bloodstream, it very quickly gets to the brain and has this immediate and long-term and lasting effect on us. And it suggests that we take immediate action on that message. If it's an ad, we immediately would want to go out and buy that product. Well, again, this was the thinking 80 and 90 years ago, 70, 80, 90 years ago. No one is ascribing much power to this theory today, because we have had enough experience over the 70 or 80 years with the mass media to know that this really isn't the case. We don't respond so immediately and so powerfully to the messages of the mass media. Bottom line is, it didn't take long, maybe 10 years or so, for the thinking of the social scientist to really do a full 180, do a complete turnaround, suggesting that maybe the mass media don't have powerful effects on us. Yeah, the messages do have some effect, but in the whole scheme of things, probably minimal effects. Yeah, we do see some commercials that lead us to go out and buy the products. We do listen to some songs on the radio or on our media player that make us feel happy, or maybe lead to catharsis. The idea that we can work our way through emotions listening to music or watching a sad movie and be led to cry and then feel better. Okay, so the thinking is, yeah, the mass media content, they do have effects on us, but probably not nearly as powerful as were once believed. So at the bottom of this page, in the black typeface there, you see that selective exposure leads to reinforcement of existing beliefs. Okay, so if you already have, let's say, some predisposition, if you're already inclined to think highly of this toothpaste, then this next TV commercial you see for that toothpaste that you have selectively exposed yourself to, you have chosen to watch TV and to see this commercial, and that commercial reinforces your existing belief about this toothpaste. You might have thought about it pretty highly before you saw the commercial. Now you think really highly of it, and that probably is going to lead you to go to the store and buy the product. So selective exposure helps to reinforce some of the media messages that we already have been exposed to. How are we doing with this so far? Is this making sense? We started talking about powerful media effects, and then all of a sudden, within 10 years, the people who really are making the very careful studies of the way people and the mass media interact have changed their thinking, and almost in the snap of a finger, they've gone from the idea of powerful effects to what we would call minimal effects. Now, along with the idea of minimal effects, let's talk about this idea of cumulative effects for just a moment. This word in red here, cumulative, forms the root of the verb to accumulate, to gather together, to add to an existing collection, if you will. Cumulative effects theory is the idea that while these media messages might have small, tiny effects on the way that we think and the way that we perceive our world, over time, we will absorb enough of these small, minimally powerful messages, and over time, as we continue to collect and process and think about these messages, much the way that a sponge would soak up a liquid, our brain soaks up these minimally effective messages. But over time, those effects accumulate, and they start small, and like the snowball rolling down the hill, they begin to get larger and larger, and the effect becomes more powerful on us. So it's up to you to decide. This is social science. This is not like the hard sciences where certain experiments and demonstrations can absolutely prove without a doubt something like the law of gravity. You release a ball from your hand, and 100 times out of 100, gravity is going to pull it to the ground. It's going to fall out of your hand, fall onto the ground. That's the natural, what we call the hard sciences. The mass media, these are social sciences dealing with people. And we're all very different. We're all very, in some ways, unpredictable. Very hard for a social scientist to predict exactly the way that a human being is going to behave and react when they process a certain media message. But it is believed by some that our brains do over time soak up these messages and eventually begin to have some effect on the way that we think and the way that we process the content of the mass media. Pages 351 and 352 are given over to a discussion of status conferral. Chapter 13 presents a lot of big $2 words at you. Status conferral. I remember the first time this concept was presented to me, and I wasn't really sure that I understood what it meant. Let's unpack this a little bit and see if we can put it into words, ways of expression that have a little more depth of meaning for you. We all are creatures of status. Don't we all have a certain sense of our place in the world, of our status in the world, our status amongst our friends, with our parents and grandparents and other relatives? Yeah, we have a sense of place where we fit into the scheme of things. And it didn't take long from the development, particularly of the electronic mass media 100 years ago, when movies and radio broadcasting and later television, and even later than that, the internet, all of these different forms of media communication have a way of taking a person and elevating their status, conferring a higher level of status on someone. Put it in plain, simple terms, you get interviewed on the TV news and people see you, all of a sudden They think more highly of you because you were there expressing your expert opinion or relating the facts of what happened to something in a TV news broadcast. You were heard maybe making a request for a song to a disc jockey on the radio. And gosh, those are old examples. Think about social media today. Isn't that the whole idea behind Facebook in some respects? That we can broadcast ourselves to the world, and in doing so, that confers a certain amount of status on us. Well, I guess the question then is, if that happens, what kind of effect does that have on people, those who have their status elevated, as well as those who are witnessing the person whose status has been lifted up? And of course, there are no clear answers to this, but there's a lot of thinking, a lot of support for this idea that the way other people see us and the way other people think about us is many times influenced by what they know of us through our mass media exposure, because we've been seen on TV, heard on radio, featured somehow in social media, making our status more important, what we call referral. Well, it's time to get maybe a little more deeply into a serious nature in this discussion, and that's this idea of the two really important criticisms that have been leveled against the mass media for probably 60 or 70 years now. The two main criticisms is that there is too much sex depiction, sexual reference in the mass media, and too much violent content presented. Too much violent content in the movies, on TV, and the big argument today, too much depiction in video gaming, which we're going to talk about later in the semester, in recent years is now considered to be a form of mass media communication. But I can remember when I was younger, and when some of the first criticisms were leveled against TV programs for being too violent, and parents getting in an uproar, didn't want their children watching certain TV shows because they believed that in watching these shows, their children would learn violent behaviors because of that. Probably happened in your lifetime, if you think about it. Can you remember a time when mom or dad or grandma, grandpa maybe turned off the TV or shooed you out of the room, or maybe told you in advance, no, you can't watch this program? And did they ever tell you why? Well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe you understood if they did. Maybe you didn't. But I bet many times it was because their belief that watching a TV program that depicted some type of sexual situation or some situation in which violence was used as an action to resolve a problem, they thought that you weren't old enough, really, that you weren't mature enough, mentally mature enough to process that message and make meaning of it, that it might influence you in some way to adopt a violent behavior. Now, that can't be proven. Or can it? Look at the screen. TV intoxication. Let me try that again. TV intoxication murder, 1975. 1975, that's a long time ago. There was a program on TV, a detective TV show called Kojak. And somewhere in Central Florida, there was a 15-year-old boy whose name was Ronnie Zamora. And he was arrested and tried at age 15 for the murder of an 84-year-old woman. And when his case went to trial, his lawyer argued before the jury that this 15-year-old boy no longer could differentiate between what is right and wrong behavior in terms of violent actions, because he had watched so many TV programs containing violence. He was intoxicated on programs about murder. He was drunk on murder, if you will. Presented that to the jury as his defense for why he killed this harmless 84-year-old woman. Well, he was convicted, but take a look at this. In the early 2000s, this is Ronnie Zamora, a picture of him shown in around 2004, I believe. And you can read at the bottom of the screen, he was imprisoned for 27 years, convicted in the killing of this woman. It says 83 years old here. I think I mentioned 84. Give or take a year, you understand. An elderly woman in this instance. But again, think about why we're talking about this subject. He no longer could mentally process his thoughts. He no longer could act sanely when it came to violent behavior because so much TV programming showing murders and gunshots and all kinds of mayhem had destroyed his ability to be able to tell the difference between right and wrong behavior. Now that's that idea of using that as a defense. Think about this. That's ascribing a tremendous amount of power to the mass media and its ability to affect the way that at least this person, the way that he thought. TV intoxication on murder. And eventually released from prison and sent out of the United States, deported back to his native home in Costa Rica. Well, we continue, maybe in a little bit different vein about depictions of media violence. Some people would say that the content of the mass media, we're probably talking now maybe more like TV and movies and video games, that the purpose of the mass media, the effect that it has on us, is that of diversion. In other words, it diverts our mind from our present day thinking about everything that's going on in our lives, individually, and we can find some escapism. We can forget our daily activities, our daily troubles, perhaps sometimes, by getting lost in the story of a movie or the story of a TV show, or getting involved in the storyline of playing a video game. We can get lost in that. We divert our thinking from our everyday world into this imaginary world of the mass media story. And in doing so, sometimes what happens is we experience catharsis, what's known as parenthetically, a cathartic effect. That's discussed on, as you see, page 359. Catharsis is it's a description of how we use mass media content, watching a movie, reading a good book, listening to music. It's all a description of how we purge our emotions to cleanse the body and feel better about ourselves because we now have a basis of comparison perhaps with someone in a worse situation than ours. Think of catharsis simply as a way of working through our emotions, getting to a better sense of feeling because we've seen a sad movie or heard a sad song and broke out into tears, and the idea is if you cry, then you feel better afterward. That's catharsis. Escapism, hey, what better place to do that than in a movie theater? Think about that experience for a moment. You go to a big auditorium, and when the movie starts, the lights go low, it gets dark in the theater. Your attention is attracted, it's drawn like a magnet to that great big screen in front of you. It sort of is excluding everything else in the world. All your eyes can focus on is that big screen that's ahead of you and the sound that comes from all directions inside the theater. Much like a cocoon. We're cocooned in this theater. We're removed from everything in the real world so that we can enter this fictional world of the movie story. And we escape from the real world. And for a couple of hours, we're different people. And depending on, the movie plot, and depending on how it affects, people, they feel better. We feel better when we leave. And I think it's interesting, maybe as a sidebar, to note that two people can be exposed to the exact same media content. They can see the same movie, read the same book, listen to the same song, yet come away with two entirely different thoughts about it. One person may be uplifted, the other one may be depressed by what they've seen or heard. We're human beings. Our behaviors, the effects of mass media on us, pretty hard to predict. Pretty hard to predict. In some ways, we all react similarly. You may or may not have heard the old expression. It's been around for a long time. If you want to get an idea of whether or not how people tend to be more alike than they are not alike or disalike, is the old saying is yell the word fire in a crowded theater. And if there's 100 people in that theater, you're going to see 100 people quickly getting up and making their way for the exit. Everybody's going to behave exactly the same way. Survival, get me out of this place. Okay, so in that instance, maybe there is something to be said about the fact that we do behave similarly. But in a lot of other ways with media content, maybe just maybe that's not the case. Take a look at the cartoon here. It's not a cartoon, it's a drawing of a young child in kindergarten reacting with this blow-up doll. This blow-up doll that you see on the left-hand side is called a Bobo doll, B-O-B-O. And this is discussed in your textbook to give an example about the relationship between being exposed to mass media content and then acting out violently as a result of having seen a movie where violence is depicted. Now, this is a study that was made a long time ago, way back in 1960. And here's the story. There were questions about whether or not if young children saw violent content or violent acts depicted in a TV show or in a movie, would they behave violently after having seen that? So here's the story. Social science researchers went to some kindergartens and they took classes of kindergartners and divided them into two groups. And one group was not aware of what the other group was doing. And so the social researchers, showed one group of kids, these are 4, 5, 6-year-olds, showed them movies that had scenes of nature and animals, deer and bunny rabbits and squirrels and so forth, babbling brooks winding their way through the countryside. Very peaceful nature scenes. The other group of kids were taken to a different room. They were shown movies or parts of TV programs that depicted violent behavior by humans on humans. Gunshots, murders, violent content. And so afterward, they put the two groups of kids back together, put them in a playroom, and gave them these punching bag Bobo dolls. And, well, you know where this story is going, don't you? The idea, the observance was that the kids who had watched the violent depictions in the movies and the TV shows acted much more violently and aggressively, punching and kicking these Bobo dolls, than the kids in the other room who had seen the movies of nature. So this is the type of what we call social science research that helps us. We have to be very careful that we don't say something like, watching a violent TV program caused these children to behave violently. We know that happened, but we don't know that one thing necessarily caused the other. We have to be very careful about making that kind of a statement. Who's to say that maybe these same children didn't have a lot of sugar-loaded cereal for breakfast that morning before coming to kindergarten, and they were all loaded to the hilt with these sugary cereals, and were, very hyperactive, and maybe that's what caused them to behave so violently against these Bobo dolls. So what we would say is the studies suggest that there's a relationship, a linkage between these two variables here. The variable of children who are exposed to violent movies, then later in playtime act out that violence by aggressively punching these Bobo dolls. So it's a suggestion. It's not law. It's not an absolute cause and effect relationship. We're not saying that, and I want to caution you against thinking that way. All we can do is just say that the research suggests that there might be that relationship. Well, here's something to think about. Many of you are somewhere around the age of 18 years. Look at this. According to studies, in your lifetime, a person your age, or an 18-year-old person, has spent more time watching TV than any other single life activity. Ooh, that might suggest to us that there is a possibility that media content does have some effect on us. Perhaps no more than in the last year have I really given this a lot of thought. I've been studying mass media behavior for a long time and teaching it for a long time. But boy, it seems like in the last year, particularly with some of the events that have gone on in world affairs, do we become, as human beings, do we become a little anxious about what the mass media tell us in the news? Do we trust everything that we see on the web, that we see and hear on radio and TV or read in newspapers? And if so, are we getting too much media information? And so there are some people who conduct mass media research that try to determine, as we see on the painful expression of this young lady on the screen, is she able to process all of this information? Is it literally driving her into a state of despair because she can't make sense of all of these different pieces of information that are coming to her in the news media about this politician, about this fake news, about whatever? Do the media have that kind of effect on us? Do they just overload our brains to the point where we shut down? We just can't process it all. Well, I'm asking that question rhetorically. I'm asking you to think about it. Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever felt like you just can't process all the information that's out there? When you Google something and you get 2 billion plus returns on it, how do you process all that information? And in the process of trying to do that, do you become anxious about it? Does it induce anxiety? Is that the effect the mass media are having on us? Well, let's hope not. Out on Moodle, there's a link to a video that I'd like for you to watch. This is one of the TED Talks. I'm hopeful that somewhere along the way you're familiar with the idea of the TED Talks. This is what's called a TEDx talk, and it's about, I think, maybe a dozen minutes long. The lady that you're looking at her name is Jean Kilbourne, and for a number of years, beginning, I think, maybe around the late 1970s, she just became pretty curious about the way that advertising, particularly in magazines at that point, was depicting the female image. And many times in collections of ads that she would make, she talks about how she'd see a particular ad in a magazine, rip it out and stick it to the door of her refrigerator. And as the door became more crowded with these various images and ads that she had ripped out of magazines and stuck to her fridge, she began to see a pattern here. And that pattern was the way that advertising and advertisers depicted females to sell products. And it's about her discussion and observations are about the use of the female image in advertising And she contends that many times that the advertising is demeaning to the female, that many times it's not the entire female that is depicted. She is reduced to being, a female is reduced to being an object, an object for some type of sexual pleasure for male viewers. Many times a female is not depicted in such a way that you can identify the person. I'm trying to think how to rephrase this. The ad would show a female depicted where maybe you weren't allowed to see her face. And all it did was to focus on the body of the female. And she thinks that this is, as well as I do, this is a very demeaning way to treat people. So I'm going to ask you to spend about 12 or 15 minutes watching this lecture that she made, and she has some really interesting examples that she shows during this video about the dangerous ways that advertisers depict the female image in advertising. And I think it's about time for us to think about wrapping up, maybe a discussion about what we call individual selectivity. The thing that comes to mind to me right away is the person with the remote control in their hand. When you have the TV remote control, you are in charge of what you're going to see. You choose from the 500 or so different channels that are out there. You're in charge. You have the remote control. That means that you are, and you're doing this subconsciously, but you are selectively exposing yourself to media content. You have the choice. You change the channel when you don't like what you see. You go look for something different. And after 500 button punches, and you still don't find what you want, then you hit the big button. That's the one that turns it off. You're in control. You select what you're exposed to. As a result of that, your perceptions become selective, and your brain becomes even more selective in what you retain and what you're able to recall. Okay, a lot of information out of chapter 13 for you. I appreciate your attention, hanging in there with me on this. We're going to continue to build on this in chapters 14 and 15. But as I said at the outset, think about how everything we've talked about in this video relates to what you've already learned from chapters 10 and 11 about public relations and advertising. It all hinges on the big idea that our exposure to the mass media have some effects on people. That's the key to it. The problem is we can't say for certain that it happens, and if and when it does, we can't predict how necessarily it's going to affect people, because we are human beings. We're all different, and we all can and sometimes do respond differently to media messages. Okay, go take a look at Gene Kilborn's video. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you in chapter 14.